The Exalvani Empire had ruled the stars for centuries, expanding its dominion with brutal efficiency. They were a species bred for war, towering beings covered in gleaming exoskeletal armor, their red eyes burning with the arrogance of conquerors. No civilization had ever withstood their might. When the Exalvani fleet arrived above Earth, their warships blackened the sky, blotting out the sun as they positioned themselves in a terrifying formation. Their massive dreadnought, the Tyrant's Hand, transmitted a planetary-wide broadcast, its message booming across every screen, every radio, every device capable of receiving communication. The High Commander, a towering Exalvani with deep scars running across his face, stood before the galaxy, his voice carrying the cold weight of an ultimatum. You are now subjects of the Exalvani Empire. Surrender immediately, or face total annihilation. It was a speech that had broken countless worlds before. Fear was a weapon sharper than any blade, and history had proven that the moment lesser species saw the sheer scale of the Exalvani's war machine, their spirits shattered. The High Commander waited, expecting the same response as always: pleas for mercy, desperate cries of submission, and a quick, bloodless conquest. But what he received was something no Exalvani had ever encountered before. Laughter.it started as a few chuckles, then grew into full-blown hysterics. Humans all over the planet were laughing. The broadcast, which was meant to spread terror, was being shared across Earth with captions like "Who hired these villains from a bad movie?" And "Did they just copy-paste a speech from a cheap sci-fi film?" The Exalvani, proud warriors who had conquered entire sectors of the galaxy, watched in disbelief as their most powerful psychological weapon, their aura of terror, was reduced to nothing more than an interstellar joke. Social media exploded with memes. Some humans edited the Exalvani's threatening message, adding dance music in the background, making the High Commander's speech look like a comedy skit. Others superimposed clown wigs on their warlord-like appearances, mocking their dramatic posturing. On live news broadcasts, commentators struggled to keep straight faces while discussing the invasion, some even placing bets on how long it would take before the Exalvani realized their mistake. The invaders, who expected a planet trembling in fear, instead saw a world amused at their presence. The High Commander clenched his fists as he watched the response. This was an insult beyond imagination. Thinking the humans had simply misunderstood the gravity of the situation, the Exalvani decided to escalate. Their warships roared through the skies, unleashing precision energy blasts that vaporized uninhabited islands, sending massive shockwaves across the oceans. The sight was meant to inspire terror, to show Earth that resistance was futile. But once again, the reaction was not what the Empire expected. Humans began sharing clips of the destruction with captions like "Nice fireworks, guys. Try harder." Some news stations even ran sarcastic headlines. Aliens waste millions of energy rounds just to blow up rocks, and galactic conquerors, confused as humans, remain unbothered. On the streets, people gathered in groups, pointing at the sky as the warships hovered ominously, making dramatic gestures as if they were in some over-the-top space opera. Late-night comedians aired skits where they mocked the Exalvani's menacing threats, reenacting their grand speeches with exaggerated voices, making the once-feared empire look like a laughingstock. The Exalvani had been prepared for armed resistance, desperate negotiations, or even silent surrender, but they had not prepared for a species that mocked their power. The High Commander could no longer tolerate the humiliation. He ordered the next phase of the invasion, full military deployment. Hundreds of dropships descended from the sky, landing in major cities, releasing squads of elite Exalvani warriors in perfect formation. They marched through the streets with the confidence of conquerors, expecting terrified civilians to flee at the mere sight of them. Instead, they found themselves the subject of more jokes. Some humans stood by the roadside, holding signs that read "Welcome, Overlords. We've been expecting you." Others casually took selfies with the heavily armed soldiers in the background, treating them like actors at a sci-fi convention. Someone even started selling "I Survived the Exalvani" invasion t-shirts, complete with an image of the High Commander looking confused. In a particularly baffling event, a group of humans staged an impromptu parade, complete with marching bands, following behind the Exalvani troops and playing celebratory music, as if the invasion were some kind of grand festival. The soldiers, who had spent their lives instilling fear, found themselves utterly bewildered. How were they supposed to fight an enemy that didn't take them seriously? The Empire's war doctrine was built upon psychological dominance. They won by breaking the spirit of their enemies before even engaging in battle. But humans, these strange, unpredictable creatures, refused to be afraid. Instead of seeing the Exalvani as unstoppable conquerors, they saw them as an amusing inconvenience. Even the most hardened Exalvani warriors felt doubt creeping into their minds. Some of them began exchanging nervous glances, unsure of how to proceed. The High Commander, furious beyond words, ordered his soldiers to enforce order, to show these insolent creatures why the Exalvani were feared across the galaxy. Yet, the moment they tried, the absurdity continued. When a squad marched into a government building, demanding total control, the officials responded with, "Sure. But first, fill out these 50 different forms in triplicate." When soldiers attempted to seize a television station, they were greeted with live pranksters who convinced them they had to sit through an orientation program before assuming control, leading to an entire squad being subjected to an hour-long montage of cat videos. At every turn, the Exalvani's attempts to assert dominance were met not with fear, but with humor, sarcasm, and endless trickery. Back aboard the Tyrant's Hand, the High Commander slammed his fists against the control panel, his frustration boiling over. Never had he faced a species so utterly immune to intimidation. Every strategic move he made was twisted into a joke. Every display of force turned into a source of amusement. It was as if fear itself did not exist in the human mind. Reports from his officers painted a picture of complete and utter failure. Morale among Exalvani troops was plummeting. Soldiers were becoming hesitant to act. And worst of all, laughter was beginning to spread even among his own ranks. Some warriors, unable to resist the infectious absurdity of the humans, had started chuckling at their antics, a crack in the foundation of the Empire's most feared force. This was not war. This was madness. As Earth continued to treat the invasion like a giant comedy show, the High Commander realized, for the first time in his long and ruthless career, that he had no idea how to win this battle. Fear had always been the Exalvani's greatest weapon. But what use was a weapon if the enemy refused to acknowledge it? The war had only just begun, but already the Empire was on the verge of something it had never faced before: defeat at the hands of laughter. The High Commander of the Exalvani Empire stood on the command bridge of the Tyrant's Hand, staring at the screens displaying live footage from Earth. His crimson eyes burned with frustration as he watched the chaos unfolding. This was supposed to be a swift and decisive conquest, an example to the rest of the galaxy that the Exalvani were unstoppable. Instead, his warriors, elite soldiers trained in the art of war, were now the subject of widespread humiliation. Cities that should have been burning were instead filled with laughter. Troops that should have been met with surrender were being filmed and turned into viral sensations. Entire battalions found themselves the victims of pranks, their advanced armor covered in ridiculous paint, their fearsome banners altered with absurd slogans. Some soldiers reported being surrounded by civilians, not with weapons, but with microphones, as reporters eagerly asked, "So how does it feel to be part of the funniest failed invasion in history?" The High Commander clenched his jaw as he listened to one of his officers stammering through a transmission, trying to explain why one of their elite squads had been caught on live television struggling to navigate a revolving door. It was a disaster. A battle that should have been over within hours had turned into an unending nightmare of ridicule. Realizing that the humans were refusing to take them seriously, the High Commander ordered the next phase of their assault. He deployed mechanized walkers, towering war machines designed to crush resistance underfoot, their metallic limbs shaking the ground as they moved through the cities. Their energy cannons hummed with power, prepared to blast through anything in their path. This was it. This would show humanity that the Exalvani Empire was not to be mocked. And yet, before a single shot was fired, the unexpected happened once again. Instead of running in terror, humans gathered around, staring at the massive war machines with amused curiosity. Then someone blasted loud music from a nearby rooftop, an old Earth song with an oddly fitting beat. As the walkers advanced, the rhythm of their mechanical legs accidentally synced with the music, making it look as if they were marching in a choreographed dance routine. Within minutes, videos spread across the internet, captions reading HFY war machines, now performing live. The battle that was meant to crush Earth's spirit became the most talked-about entertainment event of the year. The HFY pilots inside the walkers tried to ignore the absurdity, but then the real problems began. Civilian hackers, ordinary humans with nothing but a laptop and a sense of mischief, breached the walkers' control systems, overriding their targeting protocols. Instead of attacking key strategic points, the machines were forced to perform ridiculous movements, their once-feared energy cannons now harmlessly spinning in loops. Some walkers were redirected into fountains, their advanced hydraulics short-circuiting as water sprayed over them. Others were programmed to do a clumsy dance, making them look like drunken performers in a mechanical circus. The HFY on the ground could only watch in horror as their terrifying war machines became the laughingstock of the invasion. Soldiers who were supposed to be leading the charge found themselves slipping on floors covered in soap, tripping over unexpected obstacles, and being redirected by pranksters who had altered city signs to lead them in circles. The invasion had become a farce, an unintentional comedy show where the invaders were the main attraction. Frustrated beyond reason, the High Commander decided to launch a direct assault on a key government building, hoping to at least establish some form of control. A platoon of HFY stormed into the massive structure, weapons raised, expecting resistance. But instead of a desperate fight, they were met with an unexplainable sight: dozens of humans standing in neat lines, holding stacks of paper. One of them, a woman in a business suit, adjusted her glasses and handed a thick booklet to the lead HFY soldier. "Before you can take over," she said with an absolutely straight face, "you need to fill out these forms." Standard planetary invasion procedure. The soldier, caught off guard, hesitated before taking the papers. The woman continued, "You need to apply for an official authorization permit. The processing time is approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Behind her, more humans nodded in agreement, some even offering pens. The HFY, who had been trained in war but not bureaucracy, stood frozen in confusion. One of them cautiously flipped through the papers, his mandibles twitching. "These are real documents," he muttered in disbelief. And then, to the utter horror of the Empire's forces, a few of their soldiers, overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity, actually started filling out the forms, too disoriented to process what was happening. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a squadron of HFY warriors attempted to impose martial law, demanding that civilians bow before their new rulers. Instead of obeying, a group of street performers mistook the aliens for participants in their act. Without hesitation, they handed the HFY brightly colored costumes and dragged them into an impromptu stage performance. Cameras flashed, and before they knew it, one particularly unlucky officer found himself dressed as a court jester, his sharp armor covered in ridiculous decorations. He tried to resist, but the humans cheered so enthusiastically that he felt an unfamiliar emotion creeping into his mind: genuine embarrassment. The High Commander, watching the disaster unfold from the tyrant's hand, felt his grip on reality slipping. This was supposed to be a war, an invasion, a show of force. Instead, his troops were being psychologically dismantled by a species that refused to acknowledge fear. Reports from across the planet only made things worse. Some HFY patrols had been tricked into attending what they thought was a military strategy meeting, only to realize too late that it was actually a surprise party. Others had their weapons sabotaged in the most ridiculous ways: energy rifles that played comedy sound effects when fired, armor plating that had been tampered with to display ridiculous neon slogans whenever activated. In a particularly humiliating incident, an entire squad was seen running in panic after being chased by an enthusiastic human child, waving a toy sword, shouting, "I challenge you to a duel." The galaxy had never seen anything like this. It was not a war. It was an embarrassment on a scale so massive that even the most hardened HFY warriors were beginning to question everything they had been taught about power and fear. The High Commander's frustration turned into something far worse: doubt. If fear did not work, if intimidation was useless, then what could possibly subdue these humans? His forces were not just failing to conquer the planet, they were actively falling apart. Laughter had spread like a virus, infecting even the most disciplined soldiers. Some Exalvani, despite their years of strict training, had begun to crack. A few had been seen chuckling at human antics. One officer had even been caught attempting to tell a joke himself, much to the horror of his superiors. This was not how things were supposed to go. The Empire's greatest weapon, its aura of terror, was crumbling. And as the High Commander looked at the chaos unfolding below, he realized that the greatest battle in Exalvani history was not a battle at all. It was something far worse. It was a war they had already lost without a single shot being fired. The High Commander of the Exalvani Empire sat in silence, his claws gripping the edges of his command chair. His glowing eyes burned with frustration as the reports continued to flood in. His forces, the finest warriors of the Empire, had been utterly humiliated. What was meant to be a swift and brutal conquest had turned into a nightmarish spectacle, where the mighty Exalvini war machine had become the subject of laughter, mockery, and absurd human antics. Even now, as he watched the latest footage from the planet's surface, his mandibles clenched in disbelief. A group of his soldiers, once feared across the galaxy, were being forced to participate in what humans called a flash mob. Their towering war machines had been hacked and turned into unwilling performers, marching in perfect synchronization to the beat of human music. The streets were filled with cheering crowds, their laughter echoing through the city. The Exalvani Empire had come to instill fear, but instead they had become entertainment. It was intolerable. Desperate to regain control, the High Commander issued new orders. His soldiers were to abandon all unnecessary engagements, regroup, and launch a direct strike on human leadership. If Earth's government could be forced to surrender, perhaps this nightmare could still be salvaged. The Exalvani forces, bruised and humiliated but still determined, gathered their remaining strength and moved towards their new objective. But as they advanced, something strange happened. It was subtle at first, small distractions, moments of delay, minor inconveniences. A supply route was mysteriously blocked by an overturned food cart, spilling fresh produce onto the streets. Communications between squads were constantly disrupted by radio interference, often replaced with loud, nonsensical Earth music. Even their warships orbiting the planet found themselves facing unexpected technical issues, airlocks mysteriously locking on their own, navigation systems glitching, and emergency alarms blaring at random intervals. It was as if the entire planet itself was resisting them, not with weapons, but with sheer defiance. The High Commander soon realized the terrible truth: humanity was not just laughing at them. Humanity was fighting back in the most unconventional way possible. Instead of direct combat, they had turned their entire civilization into a battlefield of chaos and confusion. Skilled human hackers were infiltrating their systems, rewriting commands and redirecting supply chains. Resistance fighters, rather than engaging in deadly combat, were using psychological warfare, filling enemy comm channels with absurd messages, altering maps to lead Exalvani patrols in endless circles, and deploying drones that projected holograms of embarrassing moments from the invasion. The Exalvani were not facing a conventional enemy. They were facing a species that refused to break, a people who turned even their darkest moments into something absurdly defiant. The turning point came when the Exalvani reached the heart of Earth's government. Expecting a last stand, they prepared for battle. But instead of a fight, they were met with something far worse: a massive gathering of humans, standing in silent unity. There were no weapons, no threats, just an overwhelming presence of people who refused to kneel. Some carried signs with ridiculous slogans, others simply stared, their expressions unyielding. It was an unsettling sight. The Exalvani had conquered dozens of worlds, but never had they faced a species that met war with something so unexpected. The High Commander, watching from orbit, felt something he had never felt before: uncertainty. The Empire had always relied on overwhelming force, on crushing resistance before it could take root. But how did one conquer a people who refused to be broken? A people who, in the face of invasion, chose laughter over fear? As he pondered this, his thoughts were interrupted by yet another report, this one even more troubling. Across the Empire's fleet, something unprecedented was happening. Salvani soldiers, once loyal without question, were beginning to hesitate. Some were even laughing an act considered almost unnatural for their species. The human resistance had not just humiliated them, it had infected them with something far more dangerous: doubt. A single message, broadcast across all frequencies, sealed the Empire's fate. A simple human voice, calm and unwavering, spoke the words that would haunt the High Commander forever. You cannot rule a people who refuse to fear you. At that moment, the High Commander understood the truth. The Exalvani had already lost. Not because they were outgunned or outmatched, but because they had underestimated the sheer, unbreakable spirit of humanity. Earth was not a planet that could be conquered. It was a force of nature, a species that turned even the darkest moments into something defiant, something unstoppable. The Exalvani had wanted submission, but all they had received was mockery and resistance. And as the High Commander gave the final order to retreat, he realized that this would not be remembered as a war. No, this would be remembered as something far worse, that it would be remembered as the day the mighty Exalvani Empire was defeated by laughter. The High Commander sat alone in his private chamber aboard the Tyrant's Hand, staring at the holographic reports flashing before him. Every piece of information told the same horrifying story: the once mighty Exalvani Empire was crumbling. What had begun as a simple invasion had turned into an irreversible disaster. He had come to Earth expecting submission, expecting to crush humanity beneath the iron grip of imperial rule. Instead, his soldiers had been humiliated, their terrifying war machines reduced to laughingstocks, their authority shattered by nothing more than human defiance. But the true horror was not Earth's resistance, it was the way their actions had infected the Empire itself. The echoes of their failure had not stopped at Earth's orbit. They had spread. The first signs of collapse came from the outer colonies, the distant worlds that had long suffered under Exalvani rule. These planets, once ruled through fear and oppression, had seen what humanity had done. They had watched as Earth refused to submit, as the Exalvani, who had once been the most feared warriors in the galaxy, were mocked and ridiculed. And something within those oppressed species shifted. Fear had always been the Empire's greatest weapon, but Earth had proven that fear could be destroyed with laughter, with resilience, with an unbreakable spirit. It was as if the spell had been broken, the illusion shattered. Suddenly, on dozens of planets, resistance movements that had been crushed before now rose stronger than ever. Uprisings that had once been silenced now had a voice. The Exalvani's greatest fear had become a reality. Their subjects no longer feared them, and the chaos only spread further. The soldiers who had fought on Earth returned home as changed beings. These were the finest warriors of the Empire, soldiers who had once followed orders without question. But now they hesitated. The things they had seen, the experiences they had suffered, they had felt the humiliation firsthand. They had lived through Earth's madness, through the pranks, the taunts, the relentless refusal to submit. And deep inside, they had begun to ask themselves a question that had never before entered their minds. Why did they serve an empire that ruled through fear? Why did they obey orders that no longer made sense? Why did they fight for a cause that had been exposed as nothing more than a fragile illusion? Some soldiers abandoned their posts entirely, deserting in droves. Others, more dangerously, began to spread what they had learned to their fellow warriors. The Exalvani government, desperate to maintain control, attempted to silence the growing dissent. Orders were given. Censors worked tirelessly to erase all evidence of Earth's defiance from the Empire's networks. Officials declared that the invasion had been a victory, that the humans had been crushed, but it was a lie that no one believed. The truth had already spread too far. Underground networks transmitted footage of the failed invasion, showing soldiers being outwitted by human civilians, war machines being hacked into comedy routines, and the Exalvani's most feared officers being reduced to jokes. And worst of all, Exalvani citizens laughed. They laughed at their own leaders, at their own once feared military. The very foundation of the empire, the idea that they were an unstoppable force, was dissolving before their eyes. The rebellion reached its peak when entire battalions of Exalvani forces began defecting. On some planets, soldiers turned against their own commanders, refusing to carry out their brutal orders. On others, entire fleets abandoned their posts, disappearing into the void rather than continuing to serve a crumbling empire. And then, the final blow came, a moment that sealed the fate of the Xalvani Empire forever. A group of high-ranking Xalvani officers, disillusioned by the chaos, broadcast a single message across the Empire's communication networks. The message was simple: a recording from Earth. A single human reporter, standing before the Xalvani soldiers, had spoken words that echoed across the stars. "You cannot rule a people who refuse to fear you." That sentence became the spark that ignited a revolution. The message spread like wildfire, repeated in every corner of the empire. It became a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Planets that had long suffered under Xalvani rule now openly declared their independence. Formerly loyal officers refused to carry out imperial orders. Governors who had once ruled with absolute authority found themselves overthrown. The empire, which had stood for centuries as an unchallenged force, was now eating itself from within. In the heart of the Xalvani capital, the supreme ruler of the empire watched as his dominion collapsed around him. Reports of rebellion poured in from every sector. Civil unrest reached levels never before seen. His own advisors whispered of desertion, of defection. Even the mighty imperial fleet, once the greatest military force in the galaxy, had fractured. Some ships still obeyed their orders, clinging to a dying rule, but many had simply vanished, their crews unwilling to fight a war they no longer believed in. The supreme ruler knew the truth. The empire was finished. Back aboard the Tyrant's Hand, the High Commander stared at the empty stars, his mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. He had spent his life believing in the Empire's strength, believing in its power. But Earth had proven that power meant nothing in the face of unbreakable will. The humans had never fought them with superior weapons or overwhelming force. They had fought them with something far stronger. With defiance, with laughter, with an unshakable belief in their own spirit. And in doing so, they had shattered an empire that had once believed itself unbreakable. The High Commander gave a final order, one that had never been spoken in the history of the Xalvani Empire. Stand down. For the first time in centuries, the Xalvani fleet retreated not in victory, not in conquest, but in defeat. Not because they had been outgunned, but because they had been outmatched in a way they had never expected. And as the last Xalvani warship vanished into the void, the galaxy watched in stunned silence. The empire that had once ruled with an iron fist was no more. The Xalvani had wanted to bring fear to the galaxy. But humanity had given them something far worse. They had given them the truth. And the empire would never recover from it. The Xalvani Empire was gone. Not in a sudden collapse, not in a single moment of destruction, but in a slow, painful unraveling that had begun the day they set foot on Earth. Their warships had withdrawn into the dark corners of space, their armies scattered, their leaders left with nothing but the weight of their own failure. Planets that had once trembled at the sight of Xalvani warriors now stood free. The species that had suffered under their rule no longer feared them. And at the center of it all, the cause of their downfall, was a small blue planet Earth. Humanity had not only survived the invasion, but had broken the will of an empire without ever meeting them on the battlefield in the way the Xalvani had expected. They had fought not with superior weapons or sheer force, but with something much more powerful, an unshakable spirit, a refusal to submit, and a laughter that had echoed across the stars. The High Commander sat in the shadows of an abandoned war room, staring at the remnants of a once glorious empire. Reports of new governments forming in former Xalvani territories flooded in, each one declaring independence. Even his own people had lost their way, their belief in the empire shattered beyond repair. He had spent his life leading conquests, enforcing the will of a dominion that had lasted for centuries. And now, it had all crumbled because of them, because of the humans. Not through violence, not through war, but because they had refused to be afraid. He had seen them mock his soldiers, disrupt his war machines, and turn the greatest invasion in history into nothing more than a joke. He had once thought of humanity as weak. But now, as he looked at the empty space where the Empire once stood, he understood the truth. Earth had done something no other species had ever dared. They had proven that power was not measured by the size of one's fleet or the number of conquered worlds. Power was the ability to stand against overwhelming force and laugh in its face. The High Commander knew that the Exalvani name would not be remembered with fear or respect, but with shame. Historians would not tell tales of their great victories, only of their most humiliating defeat. His people had wanted to be remembered as rulers, as warriors, as legends. Instead, they had become nothing more than a cautionary tale, an empire that had sought to break the human spirit and had instead been broken themselves. Back on Earth, the world had changed. The invasion had shaken them, had tested them, but in the end, it had made them stronger. Humanity had proven that they were not like the others who had fallen to the Exalvani. They were not easily broken, not easily silenced. Their resilience had sent shockwaves across the galaxy, a message that could never be erased. Other civilizations, once fearful of the Exalvani, now looked to Earth as a beacon of hope. If humans could stand against an empire and win not with weapons, but with sheer defiance, then perhaps others could do the same. Uprisings sparked across distant worlds, rebellions inspired by the people of Earth. The galaxy had witnessed something incredible, something undeniable. Humanity had faced one of the most feared forces in existence and emerged victorious not because they were the strongest, but because they had refused to kneel. Even among the Exalvani survivors, some had begun to see Earth not as an enemy, but as a revelation. There were those who had abandoned the Empire, who had begun to question everything they had once believed. Some of them found themselves drawn back to the very planet they had tried to conquer, seeking to understand the species that had defeated them. For the first time, Exalvani ships did not arrive above Earth as invaders, but as travelers, as individuals who had realized that the old ways were over. Humanity had not just won a war, they had changed the course of history. They had turned conquerors into wanderers, oppressors into the lost. Years passed, and the name of the Exalvani Empire faded into memory. But Earth's legacy remained. Their defiance had become legend, their laughter a weapon more powerful than any fleet. And as humanity looked to the stars, knowing that more challenges would come, they carried with them the same unbreakable spirit that had brought an empire to its knees. For they knew one truth, that no conqueror could ever erase. You cannot rule a people who refuse to fear you.